A modern sailboat can lose its entire keel from a single hidden crack, the kind you find at the marina's end, not in glossy brochures. Old-school cruisers shrugged off groundings because their ballast was locked inside the hull, not bolted on with 10-cent hardware. Builders promise advanced performance, but the real reason they abandoned encapsulated keels is pure economics. It is about cutting time, cargo height, and cost. The result? Safety traded for assembly speed. Was it worth it, and could your next offshore trip end upside down? The true answer starts with what is hiding beneath your feet. The heart of an encapsulated keel is its seamless union with the hull. Picture a hull where the keel is not an add-on, but a natural extension, a single, uninterrupted shell of fiberglass and resin. Instead of bolts or flanges, the ballast sits deep inside a cavity formed by the hull itself. Builders pour lead shot or ingots directly into the keel cavity, then layer heavy fiberglass and resin over the top. The result is a monolithic structure. The hull, the keel, and the ballast become one. There are no seams, no bolt holes, no metal-to-glass joints to worry about. Every grounding load, every wave, every shock is spread out across thick, continuous laminate. In boats like the Westsail 32, Barber 30, or Island Packet, this approach creates a kind of bunker below the waterline. The fiberglass skin wraps around the ballast, locking it in place for decades. There is no hardware to check, no bolts to torque, no risk of the keel working loose from the hull. The only maintenance concern is the hull itself, no hidden fasteners, no joint to flex or leak. For many surveyors, seeing a cutaway of an encapsulated keel is like looking at a fortress, solid, overbuilt, and forgiving of abuse. It is the definition of peace of mind for anyone planning to cross an ocean or ride out a storm in a remote anchorage. The ballast is not going anywhere because it is not attached. It is part of the boat's bones. Now take a look at a modern production cruiser and you will find something very different under the waterline. Instead of a keel that is part of the hull, there is a separate fin, cast in lead or, more often these days, in iron, bolted to a flat or stubby section at the bottom of the hull. This is the bolt-on external fin keel. The hull comes out of the mold with a reinforced patch called the keel stub, drilled through for a small group of stainless steel bolts. The keel itself arrives as a finished casting, machined flat on top, with heavy threaded studs sticking out. Keel stub. During assembly, the yard hoists the keel into place, coats the joint with bedding compound, and runs the bolts up through the stub, torquing them down against steel backing plates or a grid inside the hull. Assembly matters. The entire weight of the keel, sometimes upwards of 5,000 pounds, hangs from this small footprint, supported by a handful of bolts and the laminate around them. That weight is carried by a very small area. Every bit of righting force, every grounding shock, every load from the sea is funneled straight into that joint. Instead of being spread through a thick, continuous laminate, the stress is focused on a narrow band, just a few feet long and maybe a foot wide. Stress concentrates. The difference is clear. With an encapsulated keel, the hull and ballast act as a single unit. With a bolt, on the keel is an appendage attached through a joint that must handle all the forces of sailing and impact. The bolts are the only thing holding it on. This joint is the critical interface, the point where everything succeeds or fails. In the yard, I can show you exactly how much area those bolts are actually gripping. It is not much, and when something goes wrong, it almost always starts here. A hairline crack running along the front edge of a keel joint does not look like much at first glance. On the yard floor, it is called the Catalina Smile. Surveyors know it as the warning sign, a subtle curve at the seam where the keel meets the hull, sometimes barely visible, sometimes wide enough to slip a credit card into. This crack forms when the keel moves ever so slightly, flexing against the hull stub. Years of pounding, a hard grounding, or simply the slow march of time can start the process. The bedding compound compresses, the laminate flexes, and the joint begins to open. The smile is not just cosmetic, it is evidence that the forces below are working the joint loose, and it is the first clue that something deeper may be happening inside. The real danger hides out of sight. Stainless steel keel bolts, buried in darkness and damp, are supposed to hold the entire weight of the keel, sometimes several tons, against the hull. But stainless steel only stays stainless in the presence of oxygen. Trapped in a wet, airless crevice, it begins to corrode from the inside out. This is crevice corrosion, and it is a silent, relentless process. On the outside, the bolt head looks clean. Inside the threads, the metal thins and pits, sometimes wasting away to a fraction of its original strength. A metallurgist can cut a cross-section of a failed bolt and show a shiny face at the end and a pencil-thin neck where the bolt passes through the keel. It is not uncommon to find a bolt that appears solid, only to discover that the core has vanished, leaving a shell that could snap under load. Every wave, every tack, every grounding cycle stress through those bolts. Over years, the constant flexing causes microcracks to grow. Water seeps in, feeding the corrosion. The result is a combination of fatigue and rust that can shear a bolt with little warning. The MAIB investigation into the Cheeki Rafiki Disaster found the hull floating upside down, its keel gone, and the internal matrix torn away. The official report pointed to prior groundings and incomplete repairs that left the keel to hull joint vulnerable. The bolts, already stressed and possibly corroded, could not withstand the forces of the Atlantic. The boat inverted in seconds after the keel separated, leaving no time for the crew to react. On the surveyor's bench, a failed bolt tells its story under the microscope. The fracture surface shows jagged edges and rust-filled pits. Even with regular maintenance, this kind of hidden damage can escape notice until it is too late. The Catalina Smile is the visible clue, but the real threat lies in the dark, where oxygen-starved steel quietly gives up its strength. For anyone walking the yard or crawling under a hull, that crack at the keel joint is more than a nuisance. It is a sign to look deeper, to question what is happening inside the joint, and to understand that a simple smile can be the first act in a much more serious failure. A naval architect lays out a 4-foot steel bar, a makeshift lever, and a plywood hull. He hangs a 5,000-pound weight at the end and points to the bolts anchoring the keel, 20,000 foot-pounds of force, all focused at the joint. That is the stress a modern fin keel delivers every time a boat heels or slams into a wave. The deeper the keel, the longer the lever, and the more the load multiplies. On a 40-foot boat, the keel's mass and leverage turn every gust and every wave into a test of the hull's strength. The hull flexes, but the bolts, clustered in a narrow strip of fiberglass, absorb the real punishment. In a grounding, the force spikes even higher as the keel tries to pivot, prying at the stub like a crowbar. Each tack, each wave, shifts the load from one side of the bolt group to the other. Forward bolts stretch in tension, aft bolts compress, then the cycle reverses. This is cyclic loading, millions of repetitions over a boat's lifetime. Steel is tough, but it resents being bent back and forth. Fatigue begins at the thread roots or where the bolt exits the keel. Each cycle grows a crack, invisible at first until it spreads. This is the same process that can bring down airplane wings or fracture highway bridges. In the yard, a foreman demonstrates with an old keel bolt, bending it gently until a faint crack appears. Under magnification, the fracture surface is dull and grainy, a classic sign of fatigue. In a real joint, this happens deep inside, often where water can creep in, accelerating damage through corrosion. The combination of bending, tension, and salt water is a recipe for disaster. The hull stub and internal grid are designed to spread these forces, but when loads reach this level, even a small flaw, a void in the laminate, a crack in the bedding, can let the joint move. The Catalina Smile at the keel seam is the outward symptom, but inside, stress works on the bolts, the stub, and the grid. Over time, the joint loosens, water seeps in, and the cycle accelerates. Encapsulated keels avoid this problem. The ballast is locked inside the hull, with loads distributed across thick laminate. No bolts to flex, no joint to pry, no crevice for water. When an encapsulated keel strikes a rock, damage is usually limited to the outer skin. But with a bolt-on, the boat's safety depends on a handful of bolts and the quality of the joint. Modern production boats face immense forces, unforgiving leverage, and little margin for error. The architect shrugs, the foreman shakes his head. They have seen what happens when a bolt-on keel is neglected or pushed too far. The numbers are not theoretical, they are the difference between safe passage and disaster. On the factory floor, the hull mold dictates the pace and the profit. With an encapsulated keel, that mold sits occupied for 3 to 4 days. The process starts with laying up the hull and the deep keel cavity, then waiting for the resin to cure enough to handle ballast. Lead pigs or shot are lowered in, resin or grout fills the voids, and heavy fiberglass is laminated over the keel area. Each hull then demands dozens of labor hours, grinding, glassing, and fairing in tight spaces before it ever leaves the line. Bolt-on systems rewrite the math. The hull is laid up with a short stub, cured just enough to hold its shape, and released from the mold in about a day. The keel, already cast in iron or lead, waits on a pallet. In assembly, a crane aligns the keel, bedding is applied, and a crew torques down the nuts. Installation takes a single shift, often outside the main line. The mold is freed up, and output doubles or triples, producing more hulls with the same tools. Material choice follows the numbers. Encapsulated keels use lead, dense and soft, but costly. Bolt-on keels, especially in high-volume runs, are usually iron. Iron costs 1/3 of lead, but requires more bulk and careful sealing. For a 40-foot cruiser, switching from lead to iron can save $4,000 to $5,000 per boat. Over 100 hulls, that is $500,000 in raw metal. The production manager sums it up. Throughput wins. Move ballast out of the mold, use cheaper iron, and build more boats, faster for less. A bolt-on keel does not just speed up production, it changes how the entire factory operates. With standardized keels, the yard can order castings in bulk from outside suppliers, stacking them like spare parts on racks out back. The hulls roll out of the mold in a day or so, each one identical below the waterline except for the stub. When it is time for assembly, the factory can fit whichever keel the order calls for: deep fin, shoal draft, or even a winged bulb. There is no need to build a new mold for every variant. Dealers can promise a custom draft for a specific cruising ground, and the factory delivers by bolting on the right keel at the last minute. This modular system is not just about saving time, it is about flexibility. One hull design can serve 3 or 4 different markets just by changing the keel at the end of the line. If a dealer in Florida needs a shoal draft for skinny water, or a charter fleet in the Mediterranean wants deep fins for upwind speed, the same hull gets a different appendage. The process is pure just-in-time manufacturing. Hulls and keels arrive at the assembly station only when needed, cutting down on storage and wasted inventory. If a shipment of keels is delayed, the hulls keep moving down the line, waiting for the right part to arrive. The whole system is built for speed and adaptability, not just for the sake of the sailor, but for the efficiency of the factory and the convenience of global distribution. Getting a new boat from the factory to the dealer isn't just about building it fast, it is about getting it down the road without running into a bridge. In the United States, the magic number is 13.5 feet. That is the maximum legal height for a loaded truck on most highways. Go over that, and you are looking at special permits, restricted routes, and sometimes a pair of escort vehicles driving ahead and behind. Each permit adds cost, and escorts can double or triple the price of a cross-country haul. Every foot over the limit means more headaches, delays at state lines, forced detours, and hours waiting for a pilot car to clear the way. A 40-foot sailboat with a fixed, deep keel sits too tall on a trailer. The hull and keel together often push the load well above that 13.5-foot ceiling. Now you are not just paying for a truck, you are paying for paperwork, pilots, and lost time. That is why production builders design keels to come off. Drop the keel, set the hull low in a custom cradle, and suddenly the whole boat fits under bridges and through tunnels as standard freight. The shipping bill shrinks, delivery is faster, and the dealer gets their boat without a logistical circus. In short, the height of an overpass, not the depth of the ocean, decides how these boats are built and shipped. A removable keel is not just a trick for the factory floor, it is the passport for a boat to reach any corner of the world without a logistics nightmare. When the keel comes off, a 40-foot hull can ride low on a flat rack or a low buoy trailer, slipping under the 13.5-foot highway ceiling that governs standard freight in the US and much of Europe. With the keel on a separate pallet, the hull fits as regular cargo, avoiding the expensive circus of oversized permits, pilot cars, and rerouted convoys. Dealers from California to Croatia can receive hulls as scheduled freight, not as oversized loads that sit in customs or wait for a special escort. Container shipping and roll-on-roll-off ferries thrive on this setup. A hull without its keel slides into the global transport network, loaded next to tractors, trucks, and heavy machinery. The keel, wrapped and strapped, travels as a single piece, ready for reattachment at the destination. This system slashes wait times, cuts costs, and lets builders promise delivery dates to dealers worldwide. The real reason bolt-on keels swept the industry is not hidden in a design office. It is stamped on every shipping invoice and delivery schedule. The world's highways and shipping lanes reward boats that can be disassembled, stacked, and shipped like any other industrial product. Right now, nearly every new production cruiser is shaped by the limits of a truck route, not the demands of the sea. As profit margins and shipping constraints steer design, the burden of vigilance falls on the sailor. Your safety is no longer built in, it's bolted on. Trust, but verify. Thanks for watching, and share your keel stories below.